Hello everybody, it's Jade, and this week we are covering Deadlock, which is the 8th book in the HIVE series, also known as Book 2, 3, or Book 5, 2, or literally the exact plot of Black Widow except executed way more competently. But first I want to say a couple things. For one, I dropped off the face of the earth for about 5 weeks, and that is largely because I moved. As you can see, I'm in a different spot in my house. That's because it's not the same house. And during that time, I really just... I wanted to do this book justice, and I was all over the place mentally, so I just kind of waited. And for that reason, I'm also kind of worried about this episode since I read this book 5 weeks ago. But I think overall I've got a lot of really good material to share today. Overall, the thing about Deadlock is it's pretty much universally at least liked. I don't think anybody dislikes this book, but it's also not very many people's favorite. I think that comes from the fact that between Aftershock and Deadlock, Mark Walden started writing his other series, Earthfall, which he started writing due to the birth of his second child. And you can really tell that Mark Walden's actual writing, like his word choice and the way he structures scenes, has definitely improved between Aftershock and Deadlock. However, maybe this is just my imagination, but I felt like there was a little bit less passion in this one. We get until like at least the third mark, like the 30% or 40% mark in this book before Otto actually starts to have a personality, or rather have a character other than generally snarky and has superpowers. Parts of the plot aren't treated with the same emotional gravitas as they were treated in 0 Hour and Aftershock. And I think it's worth mentioning that this is the last book that Mark Walden wrote before he disappeared off the face of the earth for 8 years. So we will talk about that later. But for now, I want to start out with going over some themes that were present in Deadlock. For one, the major theme for this book and Aftershock is who are you going to be? And we'll talk about this a lot more later at the end, but the kids are getting older. The graduation is starting to look like something that will actually happen. The kids are used to their life at HIVE, and they're used to the idea that they aren't going to be living normal lives, but what is that actually going to look like? What kinds of choices are they going to make? They're getting to the point where Nero trusts them to make decisions and take on responsibility that he never would have let them have in books 1 through 4. 5 is when he starts to kinda... No, he doesn't trust them in 5 either, so 6. The 0 Hour protocol is really where he starts to see the kids as adults, or some people who will one day be adults. And so a lot of the kids are struggling with this, you know. Otto is still struggling with what his implant is going to be used for. Laura, during her time at the Glass House, she doesn't train particularly hard to be a good combatant, but she chooses to hang on to her mental strength over the physical strength that could benefit her in the here and now. Later on, Nero offers Laura the choice of whether to go home or not, and the crux of the flashback section of this book is Natalia choosing whether to be an alpha or to return to the Glass House. Well, not even return to the Glass House, whether to remain loyal to the Glass House. The second major theme of this book is fatherhood in general. We meet Nathaniel, who is Nero's father, in the very first sentence of this book, which is... That man is the single most infuriating person on the face of this planet. Nero is talking about his dad, the best character in the entire series. And it tells you right off the bat that this book is about legacies more than any of the other books have been. We find out about the paternal relationship that Nero has had with Natalia ever since she was about 16 years old. Otto thinks about his father when he wants power. Later in the book, he connects his implant to the internet, and he feels this rush of power, but he realizes that he is starting to have some similarities to Overlord that he isn't comfortable with. Zero, the clone of Otto, who is created by Anastasia in this book, he idealizes Overlord because he doesn't actually know him. He's kind of the Kylo Ren of this book. He idealizes Overlord because he thinks that he should be like his father. Later on in the book, Laura is given the opportunity to speak with her father for the first time in several years as she makes an important decision. Because of this theme of fathers, we also have this extended theme of legacies and this control over the future. Both Anastasia and Nero are very old. They may not be old by our standards, but they are old in the sense that they're looking towards the period of time where they will no longer be alive, and they want to cement their influence on the world. They are both leaders of schools that provide personnel to their organizations, and because of this, they both want control over the people who are going to be most influential in the future. Anastasia takes Laura in the last book, as well as Nigel, who is actually important because his dad is important. But she also clones Otto, or has one of the original clones of number one. It's not quite clear which one of those she has, but she has her very own Otto, so that she can have more of the total power that will exist in the future. Nero, obviously, through the HIVE, has been collecting the students that he thinks are going to be most influential on the world when they become adults. But Anastasia is doing the same thing in her own way. It's a game of having the most influence on the world after you are gone. It's a game of leaving the legacy. Next, we have the theme of humanity versus Ascension, or also, are you going to be special, or are you going to be part of the unwashed masses? In this book, we get a little bit more from the United States government. We have Flack, part of the CIA, who is chasing down Otto and Raven, and it reminds you of what Nero has always said about the government, or the governments of the world, the good guys, that they have no idea what's going on right under their noses. They're constantly several steps behind, and they're part of the normal people, and normal people are inferior to us. Even though Flack makes some huge strides, ultimately, at the end of this book, he finds out that the HIVE exists. He finds out that the Iceland branch of the HIVE exists. Something that got blown up like 30, 40 years ago. So it's unfortunate that eventually somebody did find out about his existence, but Flack is so far behind because he's not part of this in-group, because he's not part of this club that is Glove, or the Disciples. This same theme is reflected with Otto struggling against this surge of power that he has midway through the book. Zero does not want anything to do with a normal childhood. He wants to be like Overlord. He wants to be powerful. We have Laura's choice as to whether she's going to stay at the HIVE or go back to her family and live a normal life. This whole idea of, are you going to be someone who is in the upper tiers, who has more control over the world, or are you going to be part of the masses? Another theme that we have is leadership. This is something that we've had as a theme throughout the series ever since, the whole point of the series is that these kids are part of the Alpha Stream. They are part of the leadership group. And so Nero has always been telling them about the kinds of decisions they should make as leaders, but for the most part, their actual leadership has been delegated to Raven or whatever actually needs to happen right now, or in book 3 it was Diabolus. So in this book, the kids start being able to make decisions based on their own judgment. And they have done that in the past, but this is where it really starts to be brought into the forefront. We're going to talk about this later, but at one point, Nero talks to Otto about whether to bring Franz along on this mission. And he says, as the leader of the group, it is your responsibility to decide whether Franz is ready. And Otto makes the judgment that, it would be a benefit to have Franz on the team, but what if he had cracked? I mean, back in book 1, Franz was the coward who hid in the bathroom. That kind of judgment is what we've been circling around for the entire series. Same thing about Laura and bringing along Tom in the reflected plotline. We'll get to that later. The final theme I want to highlight before we get into the actual book is admitting failure and or passing responsibility on to others, as well as forgiving yourself. This is highlighted most in the whole plot line with Laura, whether or not she's going to forgive herself for what happened in the last book. But it is most highlighted with Nero. Nero admits in this book that he has failed to protect the students, something that has been his one goal throughout the entire series. And because of this, he is also faltering in some of his other duties. He also talks to Nathaniel about the failure of the Iceland branch and potentially the failure to protect it. It's unclear what Maximilian Nero's involvement in the Iceland branch was. I really, really hope that is answered in Bloodline. So with all that in mind, let's get started on page 1 of this book, which happens supposedly 15 years ago, but who knows, where Maximilian Nero and Diabolus are walking out of a discussion with Nathaniel Nero over how to construct the Hive inside an active volcano. And I think it's really cool that there are so many parent-child relationships in this series, and all of them are so different, right? We've highlighted over and over the difference between Diabolus and Nigel. Diabolus is this larger-than-life supervillain who commands fleets of large machines, and Nigel likes plants. Wing's parents are the greatest AI programmers in existence, and Wing can't use a computer, and so on and so forth. But the two most similar parent-child relationship, the two most similar parents and children in the entire series is Nathaniel and Maximilian Nero. There are certainly differences between them, but they are the only parent-child pair that actually went into the same field, which is architecture. Dr. Nero designed and built and arranged for the construction of the Pacific branch of the Hive all by himself, which I found really interesting. I mean, obviously not everybody turns out to be completely different than their parents. But knowing that Nero has a dad does a couple of things. For one, it disproves the theory that Nero is immortal that poor Tahir Khan came up with back in book 1. But on top of that, because of that, I kind of suspect he didn't start the Pacific branch of the Hive. I'm going to go out there and say that for a while, a lot of us believed that Nero's mother, who is referenced a few times here as being more brutal than Nero and all that stuff, that she is the person who started the first Hive, and she may have been killed in the first attack on the Hive, and Nero took up the torch, but I don't actually know if that's the truth. I don't know if that's addressed in Bloodline or not. Diabolus and Nero are chased down by a shadowy figure, and one of my favorite things about this part is that they're so much more cool and agile than they are in the present. Like, present timeline Nero is always talking about, my knees can't take this and I'm getting too old for this crap or whatever. In this one, he's not a badass, but he's like at least competent at defending himself, which is an angle of Nero we have never seen before, and I suspect we will never see again unless we get more flashbacks in Bloodline. So Yeah. And eventually Nero is actually able to subdue Raven. Like, that's how competent he is. Now this man sits behind a desk. Anyway, so he subdues her, and he convinces Diabolus that they should not kill her. So after this, Nero talks to Number One and tells him that he's going to try to get the location of Anastasia out of Raven. And then we get the scene in the series that changes things retroactively the most. We've had some real bombshells throughout the series. You know, the revelation that Otto is a clone of Number One and that Number One is Overlord and all that stuff. That was huge. That was in book 3. That only changed 2 books worth of things. This scene changes 7 books in retrospect. My name is Raven, the girl hissed back at him. I have no other name. Very well, Raven, Nero replied. I imagine that someone like you must find this kind of incarceration rather boring, so I've brought this. He held up the battered leather-bound book that he was holding. I'm afraid I can't release your hands, since I suspect that they would end up around my throat. So I'm going to have to read it to you. I hope you like it. It's one of my favorite novels, and my father read it to me when I was young. Do what you like, Raven replied with a dismissive sneer. It makes no difference to me. That's exactly what I used to say to my father, Nero replied with a smile, opening the book and turning to the first page. He cleared his throat and began to read. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It had never occurred to the vast majority of us that Nero could possibly be Raven's father until this sentence hits you like a brick. As I stated back in book 3, the vast majority of the fandom, I mean, everybody was either shipping Nero and Raven or assuming that the series was going to treat them as love interests anyway, because so much weight is placed on the love that they have for each other. However, in hindsight, if you go back and read the series, there's nothing that ever indicates that there is a romantic connection there. You just know that they are the most important person to each other. Every single scene. Back in book 2, when Cypher shoots Wing, Nero is thinking about what could have happened to Raven first and foremost. The care that these two have for each other is one of the most it is the most consistent relationship in the entire series. This beat is hit over and over again, but nobody. In book 7, people started to wonder if this relationship was maybe parental in nature. This forces you to consider, wait, who are Natalia's parents? And what we see after this is that Raven learns to trust him, and then whatever happened after this, she decided to stay at the Hive. She probably went through the Alpha program, but after that, she still works there. After the Contessa betrayed Hive at the end of book 2, Raven took her place as the only person that Nero trusted. She has a higher place in the hierarchy than Pike does, because, as it was mentioned in book 6, she has a clearance level that is equivalent with Nero's. Throughout this book, we find out about this woman named Elena, who killed the only woman that Nero had ever loved. Actually, that was the last sentence of book 7. This relationship between Nero and this woman, Elena, is treated with a lot of weight. Mark Walden wants you to be wondering who Elena is and what she was to Nero. And if that was a romantic connection, is that possibly why Anastasia was so fascinated with Natalia specifically, to get her revenge on Nero? But even if Natalia isn't Nero's daughter biologically, she is his daughter actually. That has been hammered in over several hundred pages, approaching 3,000 at this point. But what this changes is Raven isn't the bodyguard. She is the heir to the Hive and to Glove. If it's true that Nero didn't start the Iceland branch of the Hive, and that the Pacific branch is his first outing as the headmaster of the Hive, then Raven has been there from the beginning. Back in Interception Point, Raven was the one who was judging who the superior alpha was in this complicated competition between all of the alphas that ended with Otto and Shelby fighting each other. But the superior alpha was always Raven. The kinds of things that they are being tested on are how well do the alphas emulate Raven specifically. The kids are being trained to be Glove operatives. It would be cool if some of them end up being supervillains like Diabolus, but the vast majority of them are supposed to be like Raven. Raven is the prototypical alpha. And so I have to suspect that the alpha stream exists in some way designed around her. In the first third of this series, Glove was run by Number One, who donated the DNA to create Otto Malpence, the protagonist that we have been following since the beginning. But a roughly equal amount of narrative time and attention has been given to Raven, even though we don't know why we are supposed to be paying attention to her. And in this book we learn that her father is not only the head of Glove, but the head of HIVE. The head of HIVE. She is every bit the protagonist that Otto is. Back in book 2, we spent a lot of time thinking about the fact that Nero wants to place his influence on the next generation. He wants to influence Glove through using his students at the Hive to take his ideals into the future after he's gone. And in this book we see that he struggles to control both of those things at the same time. But all of his influence and all of his ideals are distilled into this one person. She's the killer with a heart of not gold, but something comparable. She gets excited about big guns and fast cars. We see 3 generations of the Nero family in this book. We see Nathaniel, who is an extremely dated supervillain who insists on terminology that even Nero doesn't use. We see Nero, who likes cool costumes but really wants people to just not kill each other. And we see Raven, who is a killer, who is influenced by the new ideas that Nero is trying to push against. But she was still raised at HIVE. She still works for the HIVE. She understands that her power as the most deadliest killer on the planet comes with responsibility. But she isn't special to Nero because she's like him. In fact, she is very much not like him. She isn't a leader. We've speculated that Otto may take a leadership role within Glove one day, but we don't see that same kind of behavior out of Raven. I don't think Raven could sit through one of those board meetings, let alone lead one. But she isn't special to Nero because of their similarities, because there aren't very many. He loves her for who she is, not for what he wants her to be. So what he gives her is power and self-confidence. He shows her that she can make her own choices, and she uses that to make the choice to burn down the glass house. All right, so let's talk about Elena. We don't know very much about her. Unfortunately, I do know a little bit about her from getting some Bloodline spoilers, but I'll do my best. Okay, I'm very good at not giving spoilers, but I might give a little bit less than I should here because I'm paranoid about spoilers. So one thing that I think we can declare, even though it's not explicitly stated, is that Elena is the person whose death caused the Zero Hour Protocol. In this book, we see that Nero is obsessed with both restarting well, obsessed with three things: restarting the Hive, going after Anastasia Furin, and getting Overlord up and running. Overlord was supposed to combat an extremely powerful force who is coming after Glove agents, who cannot be stopped by Glove itself. I think that force was Anastasia Furin. She's terrifying. Nero is consumed by his hatred for her, justifiably so. I think that Elena's death is the reason why Nero dedicated so much of his life to the 0 Hour Protocol and Overlord. And so that means that everything about the series stems from that. She is very possibly Natalia's mother. She could also be Nero's mother. She could have been the person who ran the original Hive. We also know that she's the sister of Peter and Anastasia. And that they think that Nero is the one who killed her. All of this adds up to she's the most important character in the series, and we only know her name, Elena Furin. And that's all I can say. This isn't really thematically important, but I thought it was neat. We see this contrast between the things that are being used in the current Hive and Glasshouse and the old Hive and Glasshouse. We got a pretty good idea of what the old Glasshouse looked like and what the topography of it was. And then we get to see the new one, and we get to see like the actual plans for it, or rather we get to see Nathaniel describe those plans, and it's completely different. We see how Anastasia has changed the way that she approaches separating the children, stuff like that. Hive uses trucks instead of shroods. The Glasshouse used to keep everybody in bunks, but now they keep some students like Laura separate from everyone else. It's cool to see how these two institutions changed over time. I do wish it had been a little bit more different. Old Hive has both sleepers and grapplers, two things which were considered to be new in book 1, but that's nitpicking. So now I want to talk about the arc where Otto goes on a search. We see that for the past 6 months, or I would say probably more than 3 in less than 6 months. It's probably way closer to 3 months. Otto and Raven and Hivemind have been on a search for the disciples. They are hunting down different people, hunting down different leads. And we see that Otto is actually really, really competent at this. Obviously, the fact that he has superpowers that nobody knows about is a huge benefit, but he's also doing okay, like, for example, emotionally, with the fact that they've been effectively homeless for the past who knows how long. But I want to give the majority of the credit to that to Hivemind. We see that Hivemind is effectively Otto's entire social circle. He's a very dear friend. Every couple of pages we get a very sweet conversation between the two of them, in which Hivemind is very clearly keeping Otto going. He responds to Otto's sarcasm and encourages him and keeps him from doing stupid things, or at least tries. And it's great to see, especially because if we remember the beginning of book 6, Otto needed support and he went to Hivemind for help. But Hivemind was thinking too hard about the fact that he wanted to be a real boy and didn't actually offer that help, and instead it was offered by Lucy Dexter. In this book, Otto does, of course, need support, but not only is Hivemind there, he's there because he is able to experience being a real boy by sharing Otto's body. He provides Otto the companionship that he wanted, and also gets something equivalent out of it in return, which is the experience of being alive. So Otto is doing actually pretty well. It's nice to see him like this. He's desperately fighting. Like, he's not happy because, obviously he's trying to find the missing classmates, but he has a purpose. He's doing something he's good at. He's doing something that concretely, genuinely helps. the people that he cares about. And this purpose seems to be good for him. People don't need to be in this mode of going all the time. But having Otto do something that is genuinely helpful when his issue for the past several books has been whether he's toxic to the people around him, it has to do something positive to him, even though everything else going on in his life is fairly negative. Then again, let's talk about Matt Ronson. Matt Ronson is the obvious Mitt Romney XP. Oh, wait. No, in hindsight, this might actually not be obvious. Okay, so at the time this book came out was the 2012 presidential election where Obama was running against Mitt Romney. And Mark Walden spoke out on Twitter in support of Obama. Obviously, we've seen Obama in this book series and generally like him. Or rather, we've seen the guy who would be Obama in this series, and he's a nice and competent dude. Well, as competent as anybody who isn't in Glove or The Disciples is in this entire series. But somebody's running against him, and it's Matt Ronson, who is just a soulless, evil twit, who has a wife and kids that he treats like shit, and Otto kills him. Slowly and painfully. It almost comes across as weird when you're reading this. It kind of feels like Mark Walden has kind of taken the reins on Otto's character for a minute. Please, Ronson begged. I can help you. I have more information I can give you. Just don't let her kill me. Don't worry, she's not going to kill you, Otto said. I am. And then he activates the autopilot on this plane they're on and flies him out over the Atlantic, where he runs out of fuel and gets to think about his crimes for the next several hours before he dies. A bullet would have been quicker, Raven said, watching the departing jet as it grew smaller and smaller. Too quick, Otto said. Let's get out of here. So the first time I read this, I was like, Otto is not this evil. Yeah, he is. Now that I've reread book 7 and I saw how he effectively murdered Cole Harrington for the crime of, being a threat to him and Laura, I absolutely believe that Otto would just take this man out in the most painful way he can think of that isn't actual torture. But here's the thing about it, though. So now that Otto's body count is pretty high, I have to say that I feel like this is probably not his first kill on this mission. Like, the idea that this is the first person he's killed on this entire mission is laughable. He's probably killed a lot of people. So we've got this weird good-bad juxtaposition that Otto has really settled into. He's got this streak of cruelty that definitely extends from the mean little kid we met in book 1. In book 6, he was very kind and insecure about his potential villainy, especially in relation to Overlord. But he seems to have accepted that part of him a little bit in this. He is back on the thing that we highlighted about his personality back in book 1, which is he cares for the people inside his circle and everybody else in that circle can rot. Matt Ronson served as a threat to Laura, and therefore he can die like Cole Harrington and Block and Tackle, two people that Otto threatens to kill later. Speaking of which, that scene where he threatens to kill Block and Tackle was... I just love that scene. Overall, Otto feels much more confident and secure in himself because he's not being a threat to everybody else right now. He's doing something that helps. He's doing something that has the best chance of helping the people he cares about. And he gets to be a little bit mean while he's doing it. And that's who he is. Let's skip over to Laura for a little bit. there are some decisions made about Laura in this book that I don't really agree with from a writing perspective. The way that Laura reacts to, you know, the fact that she murdered 30 people in the last book is a little odd. But I thought hard about why Mark Walden wrote this the way he did, and I agree with the idea behind it. I feel like it could have been executed better. One of the things that I said at the beginning of this video is that I feel like Mark Walden was phoning it in a little bit in some aspects of this. And overall, I think this book could have really, really benefited from about 50 extra pages. 50 extra pages of people behaving like human beings. This suffers a little bit from the escape velocity problem that we talked about in Escape Velocity, which was that, you know, we have like 16 narrators, we have a whole bunch of stuff going on at a time, and not everybody gets to have a fully fleshed out arc. Laura gets an arc here, but it's left a little bit up to interpretation what exactly her thought process is at the end of this book. There are a lot of reasons that I was able to come up with for a lot of the things that she does and things that she says, but ultimately it was my interpretation. And I'm great at interpreting, I think. Was I right about this? I think so. Laura's one character that I wish we had seen more of her thoughts. Second of all, I wish we had seen more of Otto's thoughts while he was out on his mission with Raven. We see that he's doing well, kind of, but what are his thoughts? What is he thinking? We don't really see any of that until he returns to HIVE. And then, like, most of the other students don't really get much attention either. We do get some good material from Wing and Shelby, and we get some fantastic material from Franz, but Nero in the present doesn't really get very much focus. We don't see anything from the current Glove Ruling Council. Yeah. We don't get very much from Diabolus, who loses the Megalodon this book. I wish it had just been a little bit longer, so we could expand on a couple of these points. That being said, you know, it's like I said with Lucy Dexter. The book is over. This book is over. We only have the parts of it that are here. I really do wish we had gotten more, especially to the Glass House portion, but this is the book we have. So in the first scene with Laura, we see that she's doing both better and worse than we were really expecting. One of the things that I was looking forward to after book 7 was for Laura to learn some self-defense, and she doesn't. She gets the snot beaten out of her by 125, a girl named 125. Laura is referred to as 379 during this book. I did think a little bit about what this could possibly mean if it was referring to books in the HIVE series, but I didn't come up with much because 1, 2, and 5 are the 3 books that really focus on Wing, or the relationship between Otto and Wing, but 379, well, for one, Bloodline wasn't out yet, and I can't actually think of any parallels between books 3 and 7. Escape Velocity and Aftershock are 2 of the most beloved books in the series, and yet there's almost nothing that the 2 of them have in common. They're completely different. So I don't think there's anything meaningful about these numbers. However, Laura appears to have stacked her energy into San. She's really trying to hang on to hope that there will be an opportunity to try to escape. This comes from a couple of places. For one, obviously she was part of the original group that tried to escape the HIVE in the first place. She's predisposed to thoughts of escape. And 2, she's been really receptive to Nero throughout the series. She listened to Nero back in book 5 when they had the sometimes we have to be willing to kill people we care about talk. She's always been the one that's most in tune with school other than Franz. Okay, probably even more than Franz. And so her belief that Nero is going to come get them is believable. Even if Nero isn't coming back for her, she it makes sense that she would believe that Nero is on his way. However, Laura says someone who won't stop until he's found this place and burnt it to the ground. You're talking about Nero, aren't you? Heinrich said, stepping towards her. Do you really think he cares about you? 379. The girl who betrayed him. The girl who is responsible for the death of so many of his students. I think you overestimate your value to him. If he was coming to rescue you or any of his brats, do you not think he would have done so by now? I mean, obviously Heinrich should know that the glass house is one of the best hidden places on the entire planet. Second of all, this is another commentary on the whole whose fault is it that all those people died thing. Otto told Laura at the end of book 7 that the person whose responsibility she should put this on is Anastasia. And I think the book wants you to believe that it's Anastasia's fault because Laura was bamboozled in the last book. She was promised that her parents would be okay, but Anastasia instead decided to kill them and take Douglas to the glass house. Yes, Raven foiled this, but the point is, Laura was manipulated the entire time. That being said, Laura's arc deals with this whole with great power comes great responsibility thing, where she needs to learn that she has a great power within this universe, which is power over computers, to a degree that is definitely, or to a degree that is in some cases more powerful than Otto. And so she needs to learn responsibility. She needs to learn to use this intelligently. Laura says, he won't be coming for me. He'll be coming for the others, and I hope for your sake you're not here when he does. Laura continues to jab at Heinrich, but the thing is, Laura says she believes in not something but someone, and you are supposed to think of Otto. And Heinrich is the one that assumes she's talking about Nero, and so she does shift the topic to Nero in order to try to intimidate him. But you are supposed to think that she's thinking about Otto. Because he told her that she should not blame herself. Because he has tried to inspire hope in her when everything seems hopeless. And ultimately, that is what their relationship has been about for the entire series. Ever since book, 3 at the latest, we've gotten this repeated beat. Well, actually, I can even think of an example in book 1. We've gotten this repeated beat where Laura is afraid of something that's happening, and Otto is the one that says, no, everything is going to be okay. It's happened several times per book since then. And all of that's paying off here. Otto told her at the end of book 7 that this was going to be made right, and that this was not her fault. And so she is clinging to that because she has learned over the course of the past 7 books that trusting Otto is something that she can and should do. But the other person that inspires her is Nigel. So, Nigel may not have a job on the team. Okay, he doesn't have a skill, but he does have a role. He has a job. That is, he is the heart. He's the inspiration. He is the person that keeps Laura going throughout all of this time. I think if Nigel hadn't been there, Laura would have been toast, and so would the rest of the students by proxy. Nigel continuously inspires her to keep believing in Nero and keep believing that things are going to be okay, which gives her enough hope to get to the point where she creates the Hail Mary virus. But also, we'll get to this later, but Nigel is the person that inspires the rest of the students to come get them at the very end, the climax. And I can't wait to talk about that. But what we begin to see at the beginning of this book is that Anastasia's whole shtick is breaking people. But ultimately, at the end of this, she's defeated by the fact that the kids believe in each other and the kids are able to encourage each other and stuff. Something that she didn't take into account when she captured the alphas, because normally she's capturing individuals. The kids have a sort of camaraderie that they never would have developed in the glass house. And so that camaraderie is able to bite her, Anastasia, in the ass at the end of the book. We find out that everybody pretty much hates Laura except for Nigel, Tom, and Penny. I can't wait to talk about Penny later. But Laura comes up with a plan where she realizes that she can write a simple virus that will infect the drones and basically be passed back and forth between all of the different computers on the system until it makes its way out, and then hopefully it will find its way back to the Hive. I don't know if this is purposeful, but this reminded me very acutely of a very similar plot point in not Ender's Shadow, but the one that comes after that, Shadow of the Giant. In Shadow of the Giant, which takes place in the Ender's Game universe, some of the characters are captured and they create a, not a virus, but an email signature. They create a meme, and they embed in the photo that is in that meme a Hail Mary message. This reminded me of that, and I thought that was neat. So Laura comes up with a plan to install a virus on one of the drones, if she's able to write one, that requires getting access to a piece of technology through having Penny pickpocket it. This requires a distraction, which is going to be that Nigel and Tom are going to get into a fight. Laura knows for a fact that her computer skill is effectively an I win button. If she can get to that PDA, she will be able to write that virus. That's not the question. She talks to Tom and says, hey, this is really risky. Can you be the distraction? And he agrees. However, while Laura is typing this virus and Tom picks a fight with Nigel, Anastasia tells Tom, hey, Nigel's daddy is rich and yours isn't. You don't matter to me, and shoots him in the chest. The thing is, I think this is a direct parallel to book one. Remember when I talked about how in book one, the main four kids were trying to escape and Laura almost died. And Otto thought to himself that he could have never forgiven himself if anything had happened to her. And this I took as confirmation that the kids sort of knew that they weren't going to leave the island and that they didn't really need to. Because if they were in a really, really dire situation, it would have been unfortunate if Laura had died, but they needed to get off the island either way, and the more people's lives they could save, the better. That was not the case, but here it is. I like Tom. He seems like a nice guy. But somebody was going to die. And the thing is, in a more cliche story, it would have been Laura, because Laura is the one whose fault it is. Redemption equals death. But the thing is, Laura is the one who has the power to get them off the island. Therefore, Laura cannot die. And Tom knows this. Tom agrees to this knowing the risk. Laura beats herself up over it later, and Penny beats Laura up over it later, but I think that this was a trolley problem that had to be faced. If Tom hadn't been the one to get killed, it would have been somebody else, and then it would have been a lot of somebody else's. Because of this plan, because of Tom's sacrifice, they are able to get a whole lot of people out of the glass house, including a whole lot of students who never even were alphas in the first place. Those students' lives were saved by this maneuver. And it is really unfortunate what happened to Tom. But it's better than the alternative, I think. But of course, it does parallel the conversation that Otto has with Nero later, where Nero tells him to consider carefully whether to bring Franz along, because what if something bad were to happen to Franz? Laura doesn't give full weight to the consideration of how exactly to have this distraction take place. She doesn't place Tom's safety first. There could have possibly been a way to do this without getting Tom killed. Probably not, but she didn't appear to think it all the way through. And Laura has had a bit of a leadership position on the team a few times. Whenever Otto isn't around, as often as not, Laura is the de facto leader. So this lesson about responsibility with the power that she has, she's having to learn over and over again. I'm really interested to see where her character ends up in Bloodline, because I think this is something that Mark Walden has been circling around with purpose since, the thing that got her into the Hive was that she hacked into something she wasn't supposed to and didn't consider the consequences. After Tom's death, Laura says that something inside her breaks. And I think it is that belief in herself, belief that maybe it wasn't her fault. She was able to be in denial and say, well, the deaths of all those people were largely Anastasia's fault, and I'm just the victim. But after Tom's death, she knows that she has an involvement. And she's probably going to feel a lot of guilt about this for a long time. But I think this is a good thing. As we've stated over and over, Laura is a person with a lot of power within this universe. Having her on someone's team is an I win button. And the more character development Laura can have that makes her make the right decisions, that makes her be a better benefit to whatever side she chooses, is good. So let's talk about the kids on the island before Otto gets back. So we see that Nero is trying to train the 3 remaining alphas, Shelby, Wing, and Franz, all by himself, while also trying to get revenge on Anastasia Furin, while also trying to lead Glove and stuff. This man, he's really getting to the end of his rope, and it seems like he isn't necessarily managing everything well. The 3 alphas are getting really agitated that they haven't heard any updates from Nero about what Otto is doing. In fact, they don't even know what happened to Otto after he got expelled. They just know that he was expelled. And eventually Pike actually tells the kids what's going on after a truly hilarious sequence in which Shelby tries to hack Pike's computer. There was that quote in book 1 where Wing says something about, if you want to know if there's a tiger in a tree, don't pull on its tail or something like that. Shelby attempting to hack Pike's computer, of all people, reminds me of that. Anyway, we see that Franz is keeping the entire Alpha Stream, I know that's only 2 other people, afloat by doing his homework and then allowing them to cheat off of him. I really appreciate the fact that Wing and Shelby could have really, really excluded Franz here. Obviously they are a couple and Franz is just a guy that used to be one of their random classmates. But they really go out of their way to include him in as many activities as possible so that he doesn't drown and become Otto in book 6. And this pays off in a really big way later. However, at one point Franz suggests they use hypnotism, which Shelby thinks is stupid. I found this to be another point where Mark Walden took the reins and spoke through Shelby, in which he was saying, hypnotism is really stupid. Remember book 1 when hypnotism was a plot point? Yeah, that was dumb. But I do think it's kind of frustrating that Shelby dismissed this so readily, since they used to have a hypnotist on their team. Don't we remember Lucy, the dead one? Rip her, I guess. Anyway, but finally we get to the point where Wing takes the news that Otto is on a hunt actually super hard. He feels even more hopeless knowing that Otto is in danger and he can't do anything about it, which is, basically the story of Otto's life up to this point. And Shelby dismisses Franz from the room and comforts him and tells him, I've been feeling the same way. I also feel hopeless. And this is the 2nd book in a row where Shelby is not a total bitch. Not that Shelby was a total bitch, but, in books 2, 3, 3.5, 4, 5, and 6, there is an example of Shelby being effectively entirely heartless towards Laura. Even though she defends Laura in combat, she needles her about things that are going on in the plot or her romantic relationships or whatever. When the 3 girls are captured in book 4, she pokes the dragon of bringing up the love triangle while they're in a cell. But then finally in book 7, Shelby is actually supportive of Laura when something goes wrong, and then here she's very supportive of Wing in a much more direct way, instead of just being there for somebody and allowing her presence to be comforting even though she's acting very mean. And I have to assume that this comes from Wing. Wing is one of the more kind and emotionally intelligent people in the series, and the turning point in Shelby's character is when they started dating. I have to think that at some point Wing took her aside and said, hey, why are you always so mean to Laura about the fact that she's afraid of heights? Maybe you should stop. And so now that they've been together for what appears to be about a year, there's a extreme difference in Shelby's personality. She's still snarky, she still teases Otto, but she's supportive when she needs to be, and I think that's pretty neat. We gotta talk about Nathaniel. I love Otto, I love Raven, I love Franz, but Nathaniel is my favorite character. Okay, he has less of an arc, so he can't really be my favorite character since he doesn't have as much going on since he's only been in this book. But if Nero is the old guy whose ideals are considered to be ancient, this dude is that guy's crazy dad. He leans so much farther into 60s Batman villain than anyone in the series has ever even contemplated. He makes Diabolus look like a normal dad who likes barbecuing. Literally every single one of his lines is quotable. I would absolutely wear it on a t-shirt. He doesn't know how to use a computer, and he's committed to never learning. He asks people to ask hive mind things by saying, "Can you ask the computer, chappie?" I love him. He rigged his house to blow up satisfyingly, but he makes literally every single mistake on the evil overlord list. And that's the point, right? Like, he hasn't learned any of the lessons from the evil overlord list. He hired the wrong person, who ends up being a mole. His house's cool explosion doesn't actually blow up all of his files, leaving them easily readable by the US government. He yells at Otto for calling it an orbital platform instead of a space station. I love Nathaniel. And after they catch up with him, which Mitch will be talking about Nathaniel later, so I'm gonna skate on by the rest of my analysis of him. After they get Nathaniel out of the charred remains of his former house, they are escaping and the Megalodon is attacked. And I have no idea how I didn't put this together the first several times I read Deadlock, but this fight is so terrifying because it feels like you're fighting Otto. Like, it really captures what it must be like to fight Otto. You know, all of your devices just go completely out of your control. Everything around you goes dark. The things that you rely on to keep you safe are no longer available to you. It's wild. I want to know if anybody figured out what the prototype was before it was revealed, because the first time I read this, I was really just kind of speeding through it. Even when I reread this book, I sat down and read the whole thing in just a couple of hours. Like, this was the one that I couldn't put down the most out of the entire series. And I had no idea who... I completely missed basically every implication of this scene because I just wanted to know what happened. I pretty much just skimmed through it because it's a fight scene. Don't skim through fight scenes. But unfortunately, the Megalodon is exploded. So, Zero takes out a submarine here. It doesn't say how many people were manning the Megalodon, but I just googled how many people crew a submarine. It says fast attack submarines have a crew of around 134. Otto says that the Megalodon is bigger than any other submarine that he's ever even heard of. So we're going to round that up to about 150. The less the Megalodon should hurt, but this is one of those things that I wish had been treated with a little bit more weight by the narrative, if we'd gotten a couple more pages. Because, you know, the Megalodon has been Diabolus' home for the past several years. If the Hive, for example, had gotten blown up, you know Otto would be pretty beat up. But we don't really see Diabolus' reaction to the loss of the Megalodon. He just kind of moves on. So, after that, they return to the Hive with a canister that is putting out a distress beacon that Otto suppresses. And we find out that Nathaniel is Nero's dad, which is a hilarious reveal that we all enjoy. They hate each other. And Pike is apparently Nathaniel's best friend, so even though Nathaniel and Nero haven't really been talking to each other. You know that Nathaniel probably has some idea of what's been going on, just because A, he says he knows what's been going on, but B, apparently he and Pike have been close friends for a very long time. It's also hilarious that they're best friends, since Nathaniel is allergic to technology, and technology is Pike's entire job. Anyway, he's the Diabolist to Pike's Nero. So Otto gets to go back to the Hive for the first time in a very long time, and Nero lets him get his uniform back and be reaccepted into the Alpha Stream. And the thing about this is, he hasn't actually gotten the other students back yet. Nero is letting Otto come back because he's not really sure that they're going to be able to get those other students back. And his heart wasn't really in the punishment in the first place. It was obviously not at all Otto's fault that all those kids got killed. If you're going to blame anybody, obviously Laura's the person to blame. But I think really it's because Nero isn't really sure that there's anything else that Otto can do. There's a fantastic scene where Otto goes back into the atrium in Accommodation Block 7, and Shelby sees him and runs across several couches to get to him. And, as much of the last several books have focused on the relationship between Otto and Laura, and we've had as many books focus on the relationship between Otto and Wing, and we only got one little novella that highlights the relationship between Otto and Shelby, it still rings really true that she's the person who runs Tim first. It's nice. I like how the kids all have their own little relationships with each other throughout the series. But after this, Otto goes and connects himself to the entire internet so that he can try to connect to the glass house through the distress beacon that Gretchen sent. It's described really visually with Otto going back into his gold glowing avatar form that we haven't seen since book 3, which is neat because I think a lot of what happens in this book is that Otto returns to where he was at the beginning of book 3, somewhere much healthier for him. At the end of book 3, Otto was really struggling with this whole, am I human or not thing that really took a chunk out of him emotionally. But at the beginning of book 3, he was really starting to get a handle on his powers, and he had a lot of self-confidence, but he had also grown a lot. And in this book, we kind of return him to that state a little bit. He's obviously learned quite a bit, but we roll back some of the heaps and heaps of trauma that have weighed him down for a very long time. And it's nice to see. One of the ways that is shown is through the fact that he's using his avatar for himself in the digital scape, something that we haven't seen in a very long time because he hasn't felt like himself. He's just been, going in and getting the things and getting back out. It hasn't been about him, but he reclaims a little bit of himself in his use of his powers in this book. But when he's in there, he is tempted briefly by the huge power that is posed by control over the entire internet. And I know for a fact that this is going to be dealt with more in Bloodline. I haven't read Bloodline, obviously, but responsibility with power is always something that Nero has been trying to instill within the students. In the flashback, it's what Nero tried to instill with Raven. Power over Anastasia. She had the ability to decide whether the Hive and Glove forces were going to go after Anastasia, and he showed her how to use it responsibly. Wing dealt with this very early, simply shunning the idea of killing where he can, and he hasn't killed anyone since he killed Cypher. Shelby sees things as fairly black and white. If somebody needs to be killed, you kill them. Lucy used to wrestle with how much power she should have, trust in your own judgment, or have no power at all. Laura's currently struggling with it now as she realizes that her level of computer competence makes her more important than she was when she was a child. And Otto has it now, the realization that this power is within his grasp. He wishes that he had never had a taste of it, because now he knows for the rest of his life that he will be able to potentially access huge amounts of power that could allow him to take over the planet. Something that he doesn't want, but it tempts him anyway. When I first read this book, I took it as a sign that Otto would lose the implant in the end, but thinking about it more, as I've said before, I don't think that Otto can exist without that implant. Everything about his personality has stemmed from it in some way, except for a very few lessons that he has learned from his friends. His entire life has been dictated by that implant. There would be nothing left if it was gone. And for that reason, for the past 8 years, I have been under the assumption that at the end of this series, Otto will die. This amount of power that he has, the struggle to not take over the planet, is something that will undoubtedly be addressed in the climax of this series, but I don't see how Otto can lead a normal life after this. I want to be wrong, as I've said before. I love Otto. He's one of my favorite fictional characters of all time, and I don't want him to die. That being said, it's not looking good for him. He says later that he's feeling overclocked because he has this taste of power that is later resolved by gaining some power from Zero. He learns how to do the muscle control thing that Zero can do. But like I said, I think we're going to revisit this later in Bloodline, so I'm going to continue. Then we get a scene where Otto and Wing are talking in their bedroom. And this kind of hurts. On the surface, it's a very pleasant scene. They're just two boys who haven't seen each other in a long time talking about the girls they like, but they have completely different mindsets. It's almost heartbreaking on reread. For one, Wing's entire social circle for the past 6 months has been like mostly Shelby with a dash of friends in it, and that has defined, most of his thought process for a very long time. And he has kind of turned into the everybody needs to be in a relationship guy. Like, his life has been largely defined by his romantic relationship with Shelby, and it's kind of changed the way he interacts with people. In this, he makes some assumptions about Otto and Laura's relationship that are entirely reasonable to make, but he approaches it in a way that's like, hey, so how are things going with you and Laura? And Otto is like, well, I hope she isn't dead. Like, and it comes across as incredibly tone deaf. Otto says that things are complicated between them, and Wing says, well, it does not get any more simple than you like her and she likes you. And to that I say, Wing, where have you been for the past 5 books? I mean, seriously, did you miss the part where she killed 30 people? Or where she manipulated the whole group into playing a part in killing 30 people? Or the part where she shot him back in book 5? Or the part where he got captured because he was trying to save her in book 4? Like, it is actually quite complicated. And there is a point at the end of this series, at the end of this book, where Otto thinks that Laura is going to go home to her family. It is not as simple as the two of them like each other. And so Otto feels like he can't relate to Wing anymore, and he calls him a ladies' man. It's not that Wing is a ladies' man, it's that Wing has had a healthy relationship, and Otto's relationships have been defined by pain and suffering, romantically. And Wing having this normal one seems like something entirely alien to Otto. And so there's a couple of times in this where he is a little bit distant from Wing. He has a little bit of this Wing doesn't really need me anymore mentality. He doesn't tell Wing and Shelby about the whole thing where he goes into the internet, stuff like that. He still perceives himself as a little bit separate from them, especially because he spent the last several months away from them in the literal sense. And so Wing says to him here, we will always be brothers. But it kind of makes you think of, what do brothers do in real life? They grow up together and then they move separately. And they will always be close and they will always love each other. But they become less in sync over time because they no longer live in the same bedroom, for example. That's kind of where Otto and Wing are at now. And so Otto outright states at one point that he feels farther from Wing than he used to because of Shelby. And is this a good thing or not? Like, we don't know. Especially because Laura is returned to the group at the end of the book, and Otto is able to start the relationship with her that he has always wanted. At the beginning of the series, Otto and Wing were close with each other, and Laura and Shelby were close with each other. And then sort of as the series has progressed, the two groups have gotten closer, and then now they're kind of splitting off into separate pairs over time. It's different, but not necessarily better or worse. We'll see where it goes. I do want to bring up that while Laura serves as one of Otto's last remaining ties to humanity, hive mind is really what helps Otto deal with his lack of humanity. He's sort of in a way replaced Lucy Dexter. That sounds kind of weird, but Otto has always struggled with what it means to be part machine. What does it mean to be a cyborg, and am I separate from everybody else? But as someone who is pure machine, hive mind gives Otto a positive example of an AI. When Otto feels closer to his artificial intelligence side, he has somebody positive that he can compare himself to, instead of it being, am I more like my friends who are human, or am I more like my father overlord, the evil douchebag? He can be like, am I more like a human, or am I more like hive mind? Both of those things are good. This feels kind of exhausting since we just addressed something along this line, but I do want to talk a little bit about how Mark Walden deals with love stories in general. And we're kind of excluding Otto and Lucy here, because he does treat that one a little bit differently, but you'll see why. So there's this quote from Chris Carter, the creator of X-Files, that I was unable to actually find a source for, so maybe it was not actually Chris Carter, but he said something along the lines of, shippers in a fandom want a couple to get together, obviously, and they're going to keep hounding you until you get them together. And then once that couple is together, the only thing shippers want to see is that couple being happy together, as domestically as possible, and anything that isn't a constant montage of their happiness together is a waste of time in the eyes of shippers. And you can see fandoms like, for example, Arrow, which I love shitting on, where this is the case, where people wrote in and said, we want this relationship to happen, and then the writers did it, and then the story became more and more and more about that romance until the rest of the plot was largely gone. I find that kind of stuff really annoying. I've said before several times that I find romance really interesting because I find the way that people impact each other really interesting. However, I find romance itself really intolerable. I can't read love stories, or I can't read romance novels, rather. I can't like watch The Bachelorette or anything like that. My family watched this reality show called Love is Blind at the beginning of quarantine to have something to talk about, and it was really hard for me to watch because everybody was constantly talking about their undying love for each other, and I just can't take that kind of thing. For whatever reason, it really grinds my gears when people are just declaring their passionate love for one another. And there's a lot that people didn't like about the way that Mark Walden portrays romance in the Hive series, but I actually really like this approach for me personally. Not that these relationships are perfect, but I like the way that Mark Walden approaches romance at all, which is he shows you first and foremost the way that the characters impact each other, and that's what's really important about the relationship, and we spend very little time having the characters talk about what the relationship means. For example, this entire book, when you boil it down to its essence, is Otto's girlfriend got kidnapped and he's going to go rescue her. This is literally never stated at all. Everybody who's reading this knows that the plot of this book is the girl that Otto is in love with is in danger and he is going to go solve that problem. But it's referenced very, very infrequently because it would be exhausting if we had to have Otto angsting about, where's Laura and stuff. He expresses concern for her a couple of times throughout the book, but especially as we're getting closer to the end and it becomes clear that Laura individually is in danger that is separate from the rest of the students. But we don't have these long angsty monologues that I feel like a lesser series would have taken. And by lesser, I mean like a stereotypical YA series that is more about romance. The plot of the last 3 books has all dealt very heavily with Otto's love life, and yet I never feel like it's too much. And I think that's something that Mark Walden has really done a fantastic job of. I love to compare this series to Maximum Ride, which is a book series for the same audience, the same length, same genre, that had a similar amount of plot importance to the central relationship as this one does, except every page was about them making out and declaring their undying love for one another, and it just became a black hole that the series fell into. In Hive, we know what Otto wants. We know why he wants it. If you have been paying attention for the last 7.5 books, you know that the reason Otto is on this mission is to go get Laura, and we don't have to waste a bunch of time on it. So I should probably stop wasting time on it and get going, because I still have more to say about this later. Yeah, like I said, I like the fact that Shelby's personality changes because of the time she spends with Wing. It's cool that the kids participate in their first board meeting with Nero. That's neat. I do want to talk about the mission design. If there's anything that Mark Walden has done a damn good job at throughout this series, it's designing missions. Some of them have been unrealistic, but overall, I think they're really, really good. I tried to write a couple of missions like this, and they never come out nearly as good as what we see here. Every single character contributes tangibly to the outcome of this book. Nigel provides the necessary heart for Laura to be able to come up with a message in a bottle. Penny does the pickpocketing during the escape attempt. Tom does the distracting. Laura programs the message in a bottle. Otto finds the message in a bottle, and then he later designs the robots that sense the minds, which are way, way more advanced versions of the Musca Domestica that he programmed back in book 2. Hive Mind saves Otto from Zero and catches Gretchen. Franz takes out Anastasia Fury. Let's get back to that later. Shelby gets them into the glass house, and Wing distracts Anastasia long enough for Franz to shoot her. Everybody contributes. Everybody has a purpose, even if they don't have much of an arc like Shelby. So I want to go back a little bit. I want to talk about the scene where Otto goes and finds Laura in her isolation chamber. For one, it is never mentioned that Otto should go find the students. In fact, it is explicitly stated that Shelby is the one that is going to go rescue the other students. But Otto goes and finds her specifically, and his suspicions are correct. She is being held separately from everybody else. But that was not actually his job in the group. And then he goes into her room and takes off his helmet, and I don't know, the detail where he takes off his helmet before he walks up to her, always, I don't know, it just kind of stuck out to me. And I thought about this book for a while, especially because, this book I had 5 weeks to think about. And I realized something. Laura has been kidnapped or captured or something at least once, if not twice, in every single installment in this series. And Otto has never been the one to rescue her. She always either rescues herself or is rescued by Shelby or Lucy. He has tried to rescue her, but he's never actually been the one to save her. And in this book, he does get darker. He kills Matt Ronson. To go after her. He threatens to kill Block and Tackle. There is a dark streak to him that we haven't seen in a long time because he's been mostly very depressed. But beside that, in this book, which is about him trying to rescue her, he has the opportunity to just one time be that knight in shining armor, to be the hero. And maybe he will put that down after this and be a supervillain, but this time, maybe he can save the girl. And instead, he is met with this image that must have come up in his nightmares. He always had this issue about whether he was a danger to Laura, but when, after all these months, he finally finds her, she turns and says, "Oh God, no, stay away from me. Please don't hurt me anymore. Please just leave me alone." You have to imagine that he's envisioned this time and time again and wanted it to not be the thing that happens. Like, just 2 paragraphs before, it had said, he felt a flood of relief wash over him as he realized that she was still alive, something he had not quite dared to allow himself to believe until that moment. Otto's motivation has revolved pretty solidly around Laura since book 4. In book 4, when she went missing, he tried to be the person to save her and failed, getting himself captured. The next time he saw her was the time that he told her that he loved her, something we didn't find out about until book 7. And then obviously the entire plot of book 7 revolves around him helping her get revenge on somebody who was mean to her one time, as far as he knows. But since page 14, which is when she was introduced, for the past 2,770 pages, her presence has influenced him. You know by the way he behaves that he is a nicer person when he's around her, that the kindness we have seen from him largely revolves around her. Without her, he would be a different person. He develops this superpower because he is trying to impress her. He is kind to her because he wants her to think of him as a person who is kind, and that kindness leaks into his interactions with others. Keeping this scene, "Oh God, no, stay away from me," from happening is the only thing that has mattered to him for a very long time, other than preventing the rest of his friends from actually dying, but they weren't really in danger. And yet, that is the scene he is faced with here. In a series where much of Otto's fears revolve around him becoming someone he doesn't want to be, Zero is the embodiment of that fear. Zero is a version of him who is unkind, who rules through fear instead of love, as Nero has talked to us about, who hasn't learned restraint or leadership or acceptance. But most of all, he literally hurts Laura. Zero is the most literal version of Otto's worst possible version of himself that you could possibly design. He is exactly everything that Otto does not want to be, but he looks exactly like him. But it goes even farther, because after this, Zero forces Otto to try to kill Laura, which is a painful reflection of what happened at the end of book 5, callback time, but B, oh my gosh, Otto is going to need therapy for the next 4 billion years. But thankfully, Hive Mind is there to break him out of it, and Otto is able to shoot Zero, bringing him up to 2 kills this book. Good job. So he kills Zero, but obviously, thematically, Otto's badness is gone, right? The scary version of Otto is gone. No. Otto was always scary. He's not a knight in shining armor. He's not a hero. He got to save Laura this time, and his creepy doppelganger with the fascination with her is gone. But Otto knows that there's something dark inside him. Temptation to grab for power and hold on to it. He's used that power to protect Laura up until this point, but we've all seen the Star Wars prequels. Otto could go down that path and be Anakin Skywalker, so obsessed with the danger to Laura/Padme that he doesn't see what he has become. But Otto is smarter than that. So he accepts it, I think, thematically, what he does here. At the end of book 3, when Nigel and Diabolus are reuniting, and Laura tells him that he can be a part of her family, the only thing he can think is that he's different from everybody else. He had no mother. He was designed by a team of scientists who were killed to silence any rumor of his very existence. He's never stopped thinking about it. He told Lucy in 0 Hour and in Aftershock that he's isolated from everyone emotionally because of this difference in species. In this book, he's entirely alone. No team, no friends, only anger and desperation. he learned in Aftershock that there are other people he can relate to for reasons other than just being human. But finally, I think here he accepts who he is. He accepts this part of him that is monstrous, that is a cyborg, that is machine. Largely because hive mind is the one that saves him here. We know that he accepts it because he puts on Zero's clothes and pretends to be him in order to win. He accepts that Zero is a version of him. He puts on the suit and goes back out into the world as Zero. The monster that hurt Laura may be gone, but the darkness remains. However, even though almost everybody can't tell the difference, it's Raven. Raven, who once kept her distance from the children because she knew they were all going to die and she didn't care about them. Raven is the one that says, Otto has blue eyes. I know which version is still alive and which one died. To many people out there, to most of the world, to Robert Flack and the disciples, Otto is indistinguishable from the controlling, terrifying creature he just killed. But to his loved ones, to Laura and Raven, he is someone else entirely, and that's enough. I say Laura and Raven because I think Laura recognized a different eye color in this scene, but Wing and Shelby didn't until later. I've always wondered whether Otto would take over the world or lead Glove or something like that. And, maybe he will. But Otto has never been an inspiration to the masses. He's an ugly, awkward, short albino kid who barely knows the names of half of his classmates. And he's got this inner circle of people that he really cares about. But everybody else can burn. But deep down, he does actually care a little bit for everybody else. I want to talk about another scene. So Laura goes and tells Wing and Shelby about Otto's plan, which is to do the entire rest of the book by himself. And Wing is like, I have to go help him. And Laura's like, no, Otto can definitely do the rest of the book by himself. And so eventually she is able to talk him down. But then Franz shows up. Where is Nigel? Franz says, he's on his way. But right now we need to get the hell out of here. And then the next time we see Franz and Wing, they come get Otto and Nigel, and Franz he shoots Anastasia with the sniper version of the sleeper, and they're able to take her into custody, which fantastic character development on Franz that I will definitely get to in Bloodline, because I'm sure there will be another beat in Bloodline. But for 2, so Laura actually talked Wing out of going after Otto, but it was Franz showing up and being overly concerned for Nigel that convinced Wing to go back. In other words, Franz's love for Nigel outweighs Wing's love for Otto. Maybe not outweighs, but is more desperate. And the other thing is, Franz kind of knows that Nigel can't actually defend himself, whereas Wing has some amount of faith in Otto's abilities, which is nice since back in book 5, Wing didn't believe that Otto could do anything by himself. This video is getting super long and my hairdo is even starting to fall apart. Anyway, so I want to talk about what actually defeats Anastasia in the end. Remember back in book 3 where we called into question what makes a good leader? Otto and Wing are talking about how Nero says that in order to be a leader, you do not have to be loved, you just have to be feared. And Otto said that can't possibly be right, that love has to have some kind of component in leadership. I think this entry, Deadlock, makes it clear that the final thesis of the series on leadership is not that you have to receive love to be a leader, but that you have to give it. Nero has taught the children to be careful with themselves, to rely on each other, to love each other, to inspire each other. And that is why they are able to get out. That is why they are able to defeat Anastasia Furin when Raven isn't able to do it by herself. They are able to judge the situation. They're able to know that they can't rely on Raven to do everything. They are able to believe that Nero is going to come back for them. this whole theme where the good guys are able to win because of the things that they are able to do because they love each other happens over and over again. Otto is able to defeat Zero because he has hive mind with him. Raven is able to recognize that Zero is Otto because she knows what color his eyes are. That's ridiculous. Obviously, we talked about Laura being inspired by Nigel, who believes in Nero, the strongest out of all of the students. All of these things, if they hadn't happened, would have resulted in Anastasia winning. But that's ultimately the difference between the Glass House and Hive. Hive is a location where everyone loves each other and knows each other and understands each other's capabilities. Nero took over leadership of Glove, and he ruled that through fear. He has also been ruling Hive largely through fear. But the reason this works for him is because he loves the children. However, does it really work for him? That is the question. At the end of the book, Otto and Laura are called into Nero's office, and Nero says, "If you ever betray me again, I will throw you to the sharks." What is the threshold, Nero? Anyway, he asks Laura a question. You, the audience, may remember back in book 1, Nero made a deal with Laura. He said, "I brought you here to protect you from the United States military. You can go back home and you will have to fend them off, or you can stay here and I will protect you." Nero offers Laura the chance to go back home because he realizes that he has failed to protect her. As I said previously, Laura has been captured or threatened or kidnapped in every single volume. She is one of the more challenging students that Nero has had to protect, and in this case it had massive consequences. 2 things happened here. Nero admitted he was wrong and that he didn't live up to the promise that he made. But secondly, even more surprisingly, he offers somebody a choice. The defining character trait of Nero throughout this entire series, even more than the fact that he loves the children, is the fact that he's a control freak. And he takes Laura, who is one of the more promising students he's probably ever had, and gives her the opportunity to go home. I think that this heralds the end of Glove. It shows that Nero, the person on the planet most capable, the person who should have been leading Glove the entire time, is still not able to do it, is still not able to protect his students. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that he's trying to lead Glove and Hive at the same time. But it shows that there is an immense difficulty to this position. New threats keep coming up. And I'm really interested to see where this goes. Are we going to say that Glove should no longer exist? We're going to say that Hive should no longer exist? Or are we going to say that whoever leads Glove needs to be somebody who isn't Nero? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. So Laura has had 3 failures, effectively, in the last 2 books. 1, she revealed the location of the hunt, which caused 30+ deaths. 2, she used Tom as a distraction, which caused 1 death. I thought about counting that as a kill for Laura, but that's really, really stretching it, so I'm going to go with no. And finally, she lost the message in a bottle code to Zero. That wasn't something she could really help, but she didn't cover her tracks well enough for Anastasia to not figure out what she did. And for that reason, they knew that the Hive forces were coming when they were on their way there. And the question that we've had about these decisions is, how much is it her fault? Obviously, at least part of it is her fault. But Nero takes on some of that responsibility here by saying, "I failed to protect you," but he also offers her forgiveness for the part that was her fault and a path to potentially try again. The fact that he didn't feed her to the sharks shows that he does forgive her, even though what she did is way worse than we ever thought she would be able to get away with. So he offers her the opportunity to talk to her family to decide whether she wants to stay. And we meet her family. And there's some interesting things to say about Laura's family. One, they're in witness protection, which means that even if Laura were to leave the Hive, she wouldn't actually be able to go home back to her idyllic life that she had before. The life she had as a child is gone. She can either go back to be with her family in witness protection, or she can stay here. But second of all, these people are stupid. I think that's the thing you were supposed to get out of this. These people are not very bright. Is this the school that the Raven Lady told us about? I probably shouldn't have said that. She told us it was a secret and everything. Then her dad says, when that man came to the house 3 years ago and told us that you had to leave with him or be arrested, we didn't want to do it, but he told us you would be facing 20 years in prison. He showed us the proof. He played us a recording of a conversation between the Americans and MI6. They turned up the next day if we hadn't let them take you. These people didn't even know about the Hive until a couple of months ago, because Nero didn't trust them. Do you remember back in book 1 when apparently all these people were paying a ton of money to have their kids sent to the Hive? Laura is there on scholarship because Nero couldn't trust these people with the knowledge that he was sending their daughter to a school, let alone what the school is. And so Laura is faced with that decision that I talked about at the beginning. Are you going to be part of the elite, or are you going to be part of the unwashed masses? Are you going to be part of the people that are making the decisions, that have the responsibility, or are you going to be one of the people that doesn't know that the Hive exists even though your daughter is there? But really, Laura has been given a lot of responsibility throughout the series, and she has saved people over and over again. In book 4, she saved all of the Hive forces by finding that virus online that she was able to use to stop the nuke from going off. In book 5, she saved everybody by shooting Otto. In book 1, actually, in the very beginning, she saved everybody by figuring out that they could use the fire extinguishers to fight off Violet. And in book 2, she saved everybody by shutting down the robotic assassins that Cypher had built. So she has had a lot of responsibility that she's wielded properly throughout the entire series, but she has screwed up several times. The question is she going to let that failure define her, or is she going to try again and try to move on? The fact is, going home with her family would be accepting failure, saying, I could have been part of the elite, part of Glove, but I didn't make it. It is her choice whether that failure is permanent or not. She's also learned that there are people like Anastasia who are incredibly dangerous, who are going to continue to threaten the world. Is she going to be part of the people that stands up to those people, or is she going to go be a sheep? So I want to talk about some parallels that we had between Laura and Natalia throughout this. They are both given the option to stay with Anastasia at the glass house, help the Hive, or go live a normal life. They are both victims and perpetrators, little girls with big body counts who lost 2 childhood friends to the Furens and, quote-unquote, break, thinking they will never be able to recover from the events of their respective books. They both choose Nero and Hive, which means choosing to believe in yourself and your own goodness in the future, regardless of your baggage. Otto is on a parallel track, but he hasn't committed to a path. He knows he wants to live at Hive. He knows he doesn't want his friends to be dead, and that's pretty much it. Zero decides that he wants to be Overlord Jr. because he's 2 days old, but ironically has biology powers instead of Otto and Overlord's computer powers. If we ever see any more clones, I hope one of them has plant powers. So I want to talk about Nero's status as a parental figure to each of the children. He has a parental moment with almost all of the kids. Apparently he had the hots for Wing's mom, which is not weird at all. He apparently made a deal with Laura's dad for her custody, He effectively took the position as her caretaker. He pretended to be Otto's dad during a heist once. He took care of Nigel after Diabolus died. He thinks Shelby is neat, but they haven't really had an explicitly parental moment. But he's never actually sat by any of their bedsides and read them stories. But he isn't not their dad. If Otto ever takes over Glove, it will be because of the influence that he had from Nero, not Overlord. And of course, touching back on what I said earlier about legacies, each of the children of any parents we've met in the series have been completely different from the people in their family. Zhumei and Wuzhong are two of the greatest AI programmers in the world, and their son Wing can barely do math. The opposite is true with Laura's parents, who have no idea what's going on, despite the fact that their daughter makes many of the most important decisions among the children in the series. Number 1 started Glove, but was beloved by no one. Otto probably won't be a real criminal mastermind, but he is beloved by others. Hive Mind may be Pike's quote-unquote son, but they are as similar as Max and Nathaniel. Everybody is their own person and not just their parents' kid, which is why I think I think Otto is going to turn out to be wrong about his theory about the clones. Otto thinks to himself that, or actually he tells Nero, that the clones probably came out wrong because they didn't have a normal childhood. But Otto didn't have a normal childhood either. He was not loved, really, at St. Sebastian's. He did not think about Tom and Penny until they came back into his life. And he asked in passing about Miss McCready, but even Tom and Penny confirmed that she didn't truly love him either. I don't think that the lack of a normal childhood is what screwed up Zero. I think Zero was just immature. He was 2 days old. But all of that about legacies and all that stuff ties into something that I wanted to say, tying back to Laura and little Natalia. Nero apparently promised Andrew Brand he would protect Laura, and later in book 1 makes the deal with her so that she will stay. Ultimately, Nero's offer to let her out of the deal is an acknowledgement that he failed Laura, that he didn't hold up his end of the deal, and is willing to give her back to her real biological father. Contrast this with Natalia, whom he never fails once he finds her. That scene at the end where Laura is given the opportunity to go back to her real family convinced me that Nero has to be Natalia's biological father because of the contrast with Laura. Because we see that his relationship, Nero's relationship with all of the children is completely different. That, and the day before Bloodline came out, I realized that Nathaniel is the male form of the name Natalia. I don't know if that's a coincidence or not. I don't think it is. I completely forgot to address this because I thought this came up later, but there's this hysterical 2-page sex joke that Hive Mind makes that, like I said, when I was first reading this book, I was in my Cisco Certified Networking Associate class, so I was actually learning about this stuff, secure sockets and TCP/IP layers and stuff. So when I read this, I just about keeled over dead. I may be able to renegotiate higher level security protocols within the CIA machine and gain access to her more secure data layers. Ultimately, I may even be able to negotiate discrete access to a secure socket. You can tell nobody was editing this because nobody read this. I mean, how the heck did this get past? How did this get past anybody reading this? Well, it was only a first day. It's because nobody was reading it. Nobody was reading it. There are not that many sex jokes in this book, in this entire series. But this is one of the most detailed jokes I've ever seen that was actually written for a book. Like, he couldn't have found this online. Anyway. But the important bit is that he is talking about a female supercomputer named Mahel. She is the Hive Mind equivalent for the CIA. She's probably not nearly as advanced. She probably has way less of a personality than Hive Mind does. But I am very excited to meet her in the next book. But I thought of that because I was trying to talk about the last scene. Hive Mind tries to give Otto dating advice, which is just very sweet. I love Hive Mind. And Otto and Laura have a little conversation about, whether she's going to leave. She brings up that, there was a time when I thought of this place as a prison, but the glass house changed all that. Laura has seen true evil now. She can't think of Nero as being a particularly bad person anymore when she's had to live with Anastasia Furin, and, in particular, being Anastasia Furin's personal plaything for the past several months. Which, by the way, it was mentioned that Anastasia kept her around because she just wanted to torture her. What a pleasant lady. But they, she tells them that she's staying, and they make out. And they, are able to finally actually start a relationship after chasing each other around for several books now, and lots of angst and lots of bloodshed. And the rest of the group comes in, and they have a big conversation as the original 6 students. And it had been longer between Aftershock and Deadlock than it had been between any 2 books in the entire series. And I remember for the first time reading this, and realizing that there was never going to be another Hive book, that the series was never going to be finished. That's what I thought. This ending is so happy. Balance is restored to the group. Instead of having the weird lopsided trapezoid that was caused by Wing and Shelby dating, the original students are a square again, and then they have Nigel and Franz as their auxiliary teammates. Otto got Laura back, and all of the other named characters minus Tom. I felt like it was a stopping point. I felt like it was Mark Walden trying to write himself to a point where, if there was never another book, at least it wasn't ended on that mother of all cliffhangers that was Aftershock. And that's why I was really surprised that Bloodline came out at all. I'm happy that it did. I'm excited to read it. I want to know what happens. But this is the ending that we had for the series for a long time, and it kind of worked. One more thing I should mention. I should mention Penny. The thing is, Penny has no love for the Hive. She hasn't gone through several books worth of deciding she can actually trust Nero and all that stuff that everybody else has. To her, Nero and Anastasia Furin are just 2 separate people who kidnapped her. First she was kidnapped by Nero, and then she was kidnapped by Anastasia, and then Nero kidnapped her again, and now she can't leave either. The only difference is that Tom died in the name of getting all of the other students back to Nero, someone that she really doesn't care about. Everybody in this series has lost someone. Legitimately, every single character has lost the person most important to them at some point throughout the series, whether it turned out that person was alive or not. We saw what Shelby was like after Wing supposedly died in book 2, and it really hurt her, but eventually she did get Wing back. Penny has yet to see that this is unfortunately what life is like for the bad guys, which is interesting because part of what Nero told the students at the beginning is that the bad guys win, the bad guys get the cool costumes and the ability to protect the things they care about, when in reality that really hasn't been the case. Obviously Lucy died. Elena, the person that Nero cared most about, she died. The Cypher has died. Cypher was driven by the fact that Zume died. Everybody has lost someone, whether they got them back or not. And I feel for her, because she shouldn't have to just deal with the fact that people die. She shouldn't have to just get over it. but it also looks like she's going down a dark path, and Penny, please. I thought it would be fun to share. I came up with this list about, it's a Tumblr says I came up with this 5 years ago, called Stuff That Pretty Much Has to Happen by the End of the HIVE series. So back when I was really involved in the fandom, this was the list of things I thought had to be addressed in what I thought was going to be 2 more books. I thought there would be 1 more book to wrap up this trilogy, and then 1 book to wrap up the entire series. There's actually only 1 more book. I was wrong. So this is the list. It's probably not going to be all of these things, but this is the list of things that we pretty much agreed. There were a couple things that people disagreed with me on, but for the most part, this is what the HIVE fandom was able to put together as things that had to happen by the end of Bloodline. 1. Hive mind will get a human body, whether temporarily or permanently. 2. Otto will be able to control minds, or at least whole bodies. 3. Otto will carry not an AI, but a human consciousness in his mind with him, perhaps someone who is near death or displaced from their body by other means. 4. Otto will take Laura into the digital scape with him. This was mentioned in book 4 that they may develop the technology to be able to mind meld at some point. I put Laura will save a bunch of people completely on her own or with great personal risk to atone for book 7. I think that was achieved in book 8. She facilitated the rescue, and she apparently led everybody out using the robotic minesweepers. I don't think we're going to necessarily revisit that in book 8. We might. Sorry, in book 9. We might, probably not. We will know why 16-year-old Natalia looked familiar to Nero. We will know who Elena was and who killed her. I thought that Diabolus would turn out to be evil all along, or that he killed Elena, or that he turns against Nero. He's had a hand in everything that's happened and knows a heck of a lot of things that he wasn't supposed to know at extremely convenient times. He got a ridiculous amount of screen time for a dead guy in book 1. I no longer think this is it. I think Diabolus is a good person, specifically because Nigel is so good. I think he's fine. I think we'll probably have a heartfelt conversation between Pike and Hivemind, probably including Pike's death, since they've never actually had a heartfelt conversation before, despite meaning a lot to each other. We'll meet Mahel, Hivemind's mysterious lady friend at the CIA. Laura's history with the American government will probably come into play with the CIA plot, because Nero promised to wipe her record after she graduated. We probably won't get the story about Diabolus' ex-wife, but it will probably be alluded to a few more times. Nigel will either gain a useful skill, or his skills will actually be used. I don't think this will happen anymore. There's only 1 book. We probably can't get Nigel doing anything. We'll get a flashback to Hive Iceland branch. The volcano will erupt. The fragility of the system that keeps the volcano from erupting has been referenced at least 3 times. The alphas will have to lead the other streams to do something, probably escape the island when it's about to explode. Something awful has to happen to Shelby. The last time something terrible happened to her was book 2. Nero's necklace, black with a white dot, foreshadowed that he was a good person inside. Conversely, we'll have to see Wing's dark side at least once. I don't think we will get this, since he did shoot his father. I think that's pretty dark. Penny will betray everyone, but will either be redeemed or killed. Yeah. Every other female character has lost their love interest or best friend at this point at least once, and none of them lost it. Penny will be treated differently. Anastasia will get out. That's another thing. Nero didn't kill Anastasia for plot convenience reasons. We will meet Heinrich Argentblum. I don't think this will happen. There was an entire paragraph dedicated to him in the first 15 pages of the series. He will have to be introduced at some point. No, I don't think we have enough time for that. At the end of the series, someone else will be in charge of the Hive, whether Nero leads Glove or not. I think my actual prediction at this point is volcano will erupt, the Hive itself will be lost, Nero will probably die, but Raven will continue leading it. That's my actual prediction. But it will look different in the future, I think. Maybe they'll get rid of the henchmen. It'll just be the alphas. I don't know. I'm not even sure about that either. But on that note, I have one other thing to say. Back when Bloodline was first announced, there were a couple people that were kind of disappointed. We got an open ending with Deadlock. We were able to use our imaginations to come up with whatever ending we really wanted for a very long time. We didn't have to deal with anybody dying in the last book. Nero, probably. And everybody got a sort of happy ending. There were a couple other people that were disappointed that Bloodline would be the last book. It would be nice if the series could keep going. I disagree. As a person who's been waiting to know what happens at the end of this series since 2010, I disagree. I'm thrilled. I'm ecstatic we got Bloodline. One of my favorite pieces of sci-fi is Futurama. Futurama had 4 endings. First it was canceled, then it did an entire season of movies that came up with a different ending. Then there was a season where they thought they were going to get canceled, so they had to come up with a series finale, and then finally they were able to have a real series finale at the end of season 8. And it's fantastic. It's a beautiful, beautiful ending to the series, and the creators of Futurama have come out and said, this is the ending we always wanted. If the series is ever rebooted, know that we don't actually want it to be rebooted. This is the ending we have been leading towards since the day Futurama started. That ending, the ending to Futurama, is one of the best endings in television history, because everything is wrapped up and the series isn't dragged out beyond the point where the writers have good ideas. I love the HIVE series. I have always loved it. But Mark Walden doesn't want to be a slave to this series for the rest of his life. In fact, he has largely ignored it for the past decade. In a world with Star Wars and the MCU, nothing ever ends. There's petitions to reboot everything. There's actual reboots of things people don't want to be rebooted. An ending to a series in today's day and age is a blessing. I've always wondered whether at the end of this series Otto is going to die. But if he doesn't at the end of Bloodline, his ending will be that he made it. That's the end of the story. We will know for sure whether Raven is Nero's biological daughter. We will know for sure who Elena is and how she died. I think that's incredibly valuable. A couple of days actually before Bloodline was announced, I did this video called on Neo Yokio, which was canceled because it's not very good. And I did that video with my boyfriend. We were talking about the series, and he said that he really wished that that series was picked back up. And I said something along the lines of, on the list of things that I hope do get a proper ending, Neo Yokio is at least number 10. For a very large portion of my life, HIVE has been number 1 on that list. I want to know what happens. I want to know where these people and their stories. And will that give me a weird amount of closure that I don't know what I'm going to do with? Like, I legitimately don't know how I'm going to feel at the end of this. That is a little bit scary. But I am glad that I get to experience an ending to a series I care about so much. So that's Deadlock. Discussion question for this week, which I don't think anybody's going to answer because we've barely gotten any, is what's the wildest prediction that you had going into Bloodline? Whether it was true or not. Wildest. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Mitch.
Hey y'all, it's me, Mitch, back to talk about HIVE again. So, thanks again to Jade for letting me hop on to chat with you guys about Deadlock. I love Deadlock, it's so great, and there's a lot to say about it, I think. So I am pretty much going to be directly reading from my notebook today because I went ahead and just figured out what I was going to say, so now I'm just going to say it. So enjoy that whole mess. So Deadlock. For a long time, the last book in the HIVE series, and for a long time, the last thing we had to think about before the publication of Bloodline. So I feel like I have spent a lot of time thinking about Deadlock, and that's good, I think. So the one thing I think that Deadlock does for us, though, is it really solidifies the fact that HIVE is a series full of storytelling, and that isn't unique to Deadlock, of course. In book 1, we find out that Otto spent his entire childhood pretty much in the library. When they try to escape HIVE for the first time in book 1, Laura likens the idea to the same device used in C.S. Lewis's Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Wing reads Sun Tzu to Otto in book 5 as part of the healing process, and now in book 8 it's clear that A Tale of Two Cities is essential to Raven's rehabilitation as a teenager from her incredibly traumatic backstory. So HIVE is and always has been deeply concerned with stories and who hears them, which of course I love. But it may be less apparent that HIVE's entire structure is something of a meta-narrative, where many of the characters are aware of their participation in a fictional story as well, and that's kind of what I want to focus on today. So meta-narrative is often something that is associated with postmodern literature, and just so that we're all clear on the definition, meta-narrative is a narrative account, so in all likelihood a story, but that could be play, movie, whatever, that experiments or explores the idea of storytelling, often by drawing attention to its own artificiality. So, again, that was something that postmodern authors were super preoccupied by, in terms of like challenging the boundaries of the mediums they were working with themselves. But they're not the only ones. For example, Don Quixote by Cervantes is definitely a meta-narrative, and there's a lot of discussion of what storytelling is in that story. But others that are more modern include books like the New York trilogy by Paul Auster, Jazz by Toni Morrison I think would fall into there, and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard definitely plays with a meta-narrative, and the fact that the play Hamlet can only end in one particular way. So different authors use meta-narrative for different effect, and sometimes they do it to call into question the narrator's reliability in the story, and other times it's to make a statement about the nature of life. It really depends on what they're attempting to do and how you see it. And so, as you might expect for our discussion of HIVE, the meta-narrative I'm seeing here serves to say something about the nature of evil, which is great. And so I get that that's all a little bit of lit theory shop talk for you, so just to throw out there, this isn't like what I'm seeing here in this pattern isn't necessarily the main goal of the series, although I do think it is near and dear to many of the central themes in the series. And I think readers can definitely still enjoy the story without totally understanding what I'm talking about here. Unlike, so like in the New York trilogy by Paul Auster, pretty much near every page is like a hard and heavy deep dive into this exploration of the character's artificiality and this sense that like the whole thing is fiction, and maybe we're all fiction, and what is the world we've constructed, and you just can't escape it because it's so constantly there throughout the series. And that is not true in HIVE. In here, not all the characters show an awareness of the story aspect of their lives. Again, Laura compares her friend group to the events in Narnia in book 1, but outside of that, the core 4 don't really talk about themselves as characters within a larger story. And there's a little bit for Otto, I think, but it's not quite the same, I think. He sees things as being in terms of the larger story that Overlord has written, not necessarily a narrative the way we think of it as like a folktale, beginning, middle, and end, something that is passed down, that kind of story. And on top of that, the antagonists in this series don't really play with their own fictionality either. All of the villains seem to be kind of like dead serious about what they are doing, what they think they are doing. With the possible exception of Anastasia Firon, but I feel like to complete my analysis on that, we have to talk about Bloodline, so we'll put a pin in that for now. So, in the end, from the beginning, there's only really one character who announces his fictionality to the other characters, and that's Dr. Nero. And so we bring out our good friend, book 1. This is the shiny orange version. It is tragically falling apart, but I don't actually know if the page numbers line up with anything, but this is Nero's villainy studies speech in chapter 7 that I'm going to be reading from, and in this version it's on page 140. And basically answering, what is the point of this class? So, Nero continued, I'm sure that there must have been times when you have read books or watched films and found yourself secretly wishing for the villain to win. Why? Isn't that against the rules by which our society lives? Why should you feel this way? It's simple, really. The villain is the true hero of these tales, not the well-intentioned moron who somehow foils their diabolical scheme. The villain gets all the best lines, has the best costumes, has unlimited power and wealth. Why on earth would anyone not want to be the villain? Because, you see, that's the real problem. If the masses realized how much more fun life would be if they could all wear the black costume, where would that leave us? What would become of society if people understood that in the real world, the hero rarely wins against overwhelming odds, and that the villain always has the last laugh? The world would be locked in a perpetual state of anarchy in all likelihood, so it is important that such an education only be given to those who deserve it, those who have the intelligence and strength of character to understand the power that they wield. Let the masses have their fantasy heroes, and meanwhile the best of what the world has to offer will be yours for the taking. And so in that speech, which I have always loved, we get a few important themes that Nero is like making explicit for his students to understand. The first is the tension between story versus society, and that what is true does not always make for a satisfying narrative. We prefer for the good guys to win in stories, but that doesn't mean it's true. But by the same token, if everyone lived with the authority granted by stories, then society itself might not survive. Nero gives a argument that only the people who deserve it should have the power to be evil. The second thing is that evil is a performance, really. He draws out the images of the lines villains say, the costumes they wear, and the power they wield. And, Judith Butler is, of course, famous for describing gender as a performance, but the way Nero talks about it, it seems like evil is a performance as well. That it's not simply about what you do, it's how you're perceived and how you act. Which is definitely important also within the idea of storytelling, where interpretation is the only thing that's happening, pretty much. Which then feeds into his last idea, that the goal for his students as villains is to manipulate the story, to change what people believe compared against what they actually do. That is the complexity there. That is the issue, that it doesn't matter so much that you perform. Everyone has to perform. But do they believe it? And what do you get away with in the end? So, largely Otto's world responds to the themes that Nero lays out here. Events like the Contessa's betrayal and their interactions with Echelon in Book 6, and even the role of Animus in the story, all play with the interactions of power, performance, and social responsibility within the story here. Still, in some ways, our attention has been diverted over the last 7 books. Nero doesn't, again, make a speech quite like that first one. Although, we would note that his speech in Book 6 to the Alphas comes very close. And perhaps Wing's speech as well, which I know Jade talked about 2 videos ago. Very much so. But it's still not quite the same. So, our attention is therefore not on the storyness within HIVE. So enter Deadlock and enter Nathaniel Nero. I love Nathaniel's character, in part because he reminds me so much of my own grandfather, but also because he is a breath of meta that we haven't seen in the series in a long, long time. From the get-go, Nathaniel makes us ask, what kind of stories are we telling about villains anyway? So, I've got my purple book out today, and we are looking at page 100. And Otto has just been, like, what do you want to call it? Drugged and brought to Nathaniel's secret lair. There you go. So Otto's looking around, looking at the stuff, the blueprints and stuff, and Otto says, "This is the orbital platform that Overlord took me and Nero to," Otto said, eyes wide. "Orbital platform?" A voice behind Otto said. "Call it what it is, boy, a space station." Otto turned to see an old man with a cane walking toward him. He had long white hair tied back in a ponytail and a neatly trimmed but full beard and piercing blue eyes. It was hard to tell his precise age, but he was clearly very old, though any physical infirmity that age had brought did not extend to the fire of intelligence that Otto could see dancing behind his eyes. "A space station. Yeah, sorry," Otto said. "That's the problem with villains these days. Always afraid to do something with a bit of imagination. Everything has to be grounded in reality. No ambition, I tell you. One of your lot," he gestured at Dark Doom with his cane, "even told me last year that he didn't want an undersea base because it was, and I quote, unrealistic." Unrealistic? I told him that if he wanted realism, he should have hired Norman Bloody Foster. No imagination. The old man stood next to Otto and pointed up at the model of Overlord's space station with his cane. "One of my most challenging projects, actually," the man said. "The design wasn't that hard, but getting an orbital construction crew together was murder. Zero-G construction isn't something that's easy to get a lot of experience in. Thank God for the collapse of the Russian space program, that's all I can say. Shame you had to go and destroy it, young man, but that's the way with these things, I suppose. Tell me, though, did it explode well? It's very important that a villain's base should explode well. That's the main thing." Spectacularly well," Otto replied, looking slightly bewildered. "Oh, don't look so surprised. I know all about you, Mr. Malpins," the man said. "Quite the reputation you've made for yourself over the past couple years. You just keep blowing up those bases, young man. It keeps me in work. Anyway, allow me to introduce myself. I'm the Architect, which is a slightly pompous title that gives me a bit of dramatic mystique, so you can call me Nathaniel." Let's see. So, we'll pause there for now. I just love him. And so it is at this point where it's also worth noting that one of Mark Walden's original inspirations for this story was just asking himself the question, where do all these Bond villains come from in the Bond film movies? And for those of us who are fond of Bond, there is a little something of Moonraker and The Spy Who Loved Me in Nathaniel's words here, both with the space station and the undersea base, and which I mention because it is an explicit exploration of intertextuality. It's a sense that the things Nathaniel is saying are stories that have been told before, and the stories that have been told before are stories that have spectacular but slightly unrealistic and exciting storytelling features that make it exciting and fun and bond. And so Nathaniel is being allowed to play with fictionality as an architect, partly because this is a story, because we know here in the real world that Bond villains exist, and that their brand of evil depends on understanding that this is a story, understanding that they do what they do because the evil that they are has to live up to a standard set by the other films in the series. It has to be a satisfying story within the context that exists. Which, for that reason, my favorite part is Nathaniel asking Otto, did it explode well? Which is another way of asking a really important question about performance. Was it aesthetically pleasing? Was it larger than life? Did it make the pulse race just a little bit? Was it cinematic enough? Those kinds of questions where Nathaniel is essentially saying, did it make for a good story afterwards? And the answer is yes, it did. Skipping ahead just a little bit to page 102, there's also another little thing I wanted to bring out where Nathaniel and Raven are talking shop, and Nazim Khan, he thanks her for killing him or something, and Raven is like, actually Sebastian Trent did that, and never did like that Trent fellow, Nathaniel said, shaking his head dismissively. Don't approve of that whole being a villain but pretending to be one of the good guys thing. Doesn't sit right with me. That's why I refused to build his base for him. That and the fact that he wanted to hide it behind a waterfall. I mean, honestly, what a lack of imagination. I blame video games. Love that part also, but particularly what I wanted to bring out in there is that he is calling out Sebastian Trent for being a tropey part of the story. He is responding to the narrative and saying, well, I didn't feel like participating in the series earlier because I just don't think that Sebastian Trent knew how to tell a good story. And also his aesthetic tastes were called into question right away as well. But again, here we see Nathaniel not just participating in the plot of the story, but directly and consciously addressing the narrative structure that he is a participant in, despite the fact that he is a fictional character, and that is what is giving him this sense of meta-narrative that is returning for the first time-ish since book 1. So, father and son, Max and Nathaniel, are here, well, maybe not well aware, but at least a little bit aware of the fact that they are in a story and they have opinions about how that story should go. And what does that mean for them ultimately? So, I'm going to jump back to book 1 real quick. Page 141. So this is at the very end of the same speech that I read from earlier, from Nero about why should villains get to win. And so he says at the very end of his speech, throughout history there have been men and women who have demonstrated that villainy is not just a job, but an art form. And these people shall be your role models, your heroes, the examples that you should seek to follow. And it's interesting because earlier, just a couple paragraphs up, Nero said, let the masses have their fantasy heroes. And so that repeated use of the term hero, where the public has this idea of what a hero is. The good guys in the story, the people who are going to win, those are your Iron Man, your Batman, your whoever the heck you want, let them believe that those are the good guys. Let them believe that those are the people who are going to win. But to choose your own hero, to give priority in the narrative for the artistry of villainy, and to make heroism a matter of choice rather than of consumption, is something that is going on in his speech here. That is definitely something that Nero cares about essentially throughout the series, the issue of choice. It's not that we're being evil because we just can. It's because it's our job and we're gonna get better at it. So that is the first thing I wanted to read. And then the second thing is just it's a reread of a quote I've already read towards the beginning on page 100 of our purple friend Deadlock. Nathaniel and Otto talking about the space station. And Nathaniel says, that's the problem with villains these days. Always afraid to do something with a bit of imagination. Everything has to be grounded in reality. No ambition, I tell you. One of your lot even told me last year that he didn't want an undersea base because it was, and I quote, unrealistic. Unrealistic. No imagination. And so we have two moments where the Nero family is acknowledging the limitations, but also, I would say, the potential of their story, the story that they're in, but they see it from two different lenses. For Nathaniel, again, we know that his obsession is with imagination, creativity. He wants to be the best. He wants to be astonishing, I think. He wants to build things that will be really cool and might even be remembered someday. That is his dream. Whereas for Nero, who is running a school, he is much more concerned with structure, or perhaps what we might call craft. He sees villainy as a structure that has expectations and rules, and that has, a need to be followed for the good of society. And so clearly I think there's a source of tension in the worldviews between these two characters, and that is part of what has been following them for 15 years, because they can't agree on the nature of the art form that they belong to. Ironically, though Nathaniel claims to be a big fan of creativity, he struggles to accept it coming from others because he's a bit of a control freak, and even to the point where he won't even speak to his clients because he doesn't want to hear their opinions about anything. And on the other hand, Nero demonstrates a great deal of creativity in building his school in a volcano. But even so, the school is just the form or the container for the thing that he really wants to build, which is the structure of a school. It is the people and the lessons that matter to him, not necessarily the location. Even though it's incredible that he was able to build it in that location. And as I've been talking, I didn't write this down in advance, but I've just been like thinking about, there's a quote from Robert Frost, who was big into structure in his poetry, and so he said something like, writing poetry without a strict form is like playing tennis without a net, or maybe like a net without a net or rackets or something like that. It's like, if you don't have the structure there, then you can't play the game and you can't make the art, which to me seems much more like Nero, where he likes to have something certain in what he does, whereas with Nathaniel, who clearly does conform to certain kinds of structure, otherwise, I mean, if you aren't able to conform to structure as an architect, then your structures will fall down, unfortunately. And so clearly he's good at his job, he can do that, but there's something else that he wants, a kind of larger than life aspect to what he does, and I'm not quite sure what to label him with in that regard, because he wouldn't, if we were like, well, Nero is analogous to a sonnet and therefore Nathaniel is analogous to freeform poetry, I don't think that's true at all, because there is a form with Nathaniel, but I'm not sure what it is. So if you have a great analogy, let me know. So clearly there's tension between these two characters, and it's certainly interesting that Walden has placed this tension between a father-son pair, and that it feels and seems generational, and in addition to just being a difference of opinion. But despite their surface differences, together they represent the same thing, which is a satisfaction in a good story told, and the knowledge that it has to be done right. I think they'd both agree that if you're looking to tell a good villain story, you've got to have the witty one-liners, you've got to have the big explosions, you've got to have the great costumes, because that's how the story is told, and they know how the story is told. And so it's very funny to me to be approaching this book for the first time since Bloodline came out, because, again, this is a book so much about story, and for a long time this book represented a lack of completion, and incomplete stories, as a rule, are not quote-unquote good stories. And so yes, we have Bloodline now, but even so, as I think about it, I feel like we needed a character like Nathaniel for the story to end, not because he is essential to the plot, but rather because he is essential to what our understanding of story is, and the knowledge that this story is supposed to have a satisfying ending. Of course, I'm not going to tell you what the ending of the entire series looks like here, but I do think that there is something worth noting in the fact that in some ways this is where Raven's backstory ends. Obviously she continues into the next book, and we get more closure with her whole thing there, but in many ways the story that we've been setting up at the beginning of book 4 when we first get a look at this 12-year-old girl who's running away from a prison because she wants to be free and is willing to die for it, finally comes to its conclusion here in Deadlock. We see, one, the mission that she was assigned to complete and her failure of it. We see that she makes it home safely, and that the relationship she has with Nero is not merely, and has never been, one that was merely between employer-employee, but has actually been a familial one for a long time, and that it has been sustaining and kind in a way that Raven never expected to have as a child. And that, in some ways, I think the telling of A Tale of Two Cities is the beginning of the end for Raven's narrative, because the big question we have with when we first see Raven escaping is this question of, is she going to get away? And is she going to escape? And if you want to call A Tale of Two Cities a literal representation of escapism, then you can. But in this book, we do get the explosion of the first glass house. We do get to see Raven being held by somebody who cares about her, and we do get to see the completion of of that question, because does Raven get away? Does she escape? Yes. And we've always known that, because we've always seen Raven is a person at HIVE, but now we know how she did it. And the way she did it is through the power of story. And I think that storytelling power is part of what makes our knowledge of the next book meaningful as well. So I will leave you with that. Thanks again to Jade, and I hope that you have a good time reading Bloodline. And here is to satisfying endings. We'll see you next time. Really?
Nero sat before an open fire, an entirely unnecessary but comfortable indulgence, in his office at HIVE, staring into the flames and swirling vintage brandy in a large balloon glass. Nero did not believe in marking birthdays or anniversaries, viewing them as meaningless celebrations of arbitrary dates, but today was one day every year that haunted him. It didn't matter how hard he tried to ignore the calendar. It was no good. He looked up at the portrait of a beautiful young woman above the fireplace. "Elena," he whispered.